Thanks for joining me on Sound Booth tutorials. For more stuff like this, head on over to All Buttons In, where I will go into this and other things in more depth over the coming weeks. Remember to subscribe. In this day and age where large recording studios are being closed down and the great sounding rooms within them are no longer available, we tend to be recording in environments that are less than ideal and usually recording fairly dry. This requires us to add ambience in the form of reverb to our recordings in order to give them a sense of space and depth, change their tone, or help them sit back and blend into the background. When I first started mixing several years ago, reverbs confused the hell out of me. I, like most people starting out, probably used way too much of it. I also didn't understand why things just got more distant the more I used it, when I thought it was meant to make something feel bigger. My songs would wash out all over the place from too much of it, and it was a disaster. If I could pinpoint the one idea that helped change the way I use reverb, it would be that I started treating reverb like a superfluous background instrument, like that shaker part playing quietly that you don't notice until you take it out of the mix. Personally, now I treat reverb as though it were another instrument in the session. There's nothing I wouldn't do to a reverb that I wouldn't also have experimented with on an instrument track. In keeping with that philosophy, I would say if you aren't already, stop using reverb plugins on the same track as the instrument as an insert with the wet-dry percentage turned down, because you can do so much more with it when you place it separately from the dry signal onto an aux track. More on that as we progress through parts of this tutorial. The way I see it, there are 4 basic reasons you'd want to use reverb, and not all of these are exclusive from one another. These are to help smooth out and blend in a mix, to add depth or push into the background, to highlight the acoustic space as a special effect, and to modify the character or timbre. More on these topics in later parts of this tutorial series. First, I'd like to provide some background to the 2 types of reverb we have available as plugins, as a means to explain why you might use one or the other in your productions. Technically, in the digital domain, we have 2 sources for reverb: Algorithmic and Convolution. In some cases, manufacturers also make a hybrid of the 2. Algorithmic reverbs are a computer-generated simulation of an acoustic space based off of thousands of delays of the direct signal. You can see some of them here on the screen. Simulation being the operative word here, as these algorithms are not based on real-life acoustic spaces per se, but rely upon the programming skills behind them. These are typically less expensive than convolution-style reverbs, but that is not a good enough reason to necessarily avoid them, as we should value their uniqueness more than their cost. Reverb to Pro Tools users is a great example of that. It's a stock plugin that has been used on many hit records, and here it is here. I'll just give you a quick example of that. Algorithmic reverbs, by their very nature, are much easier to manipulate and configure to accommodate different simulated spaces, or perhaps those that could not possibly exist in real life. They can be easily configured because everything is a product of their calculations, which of course can be changed to manipulate just about any significant part of a reverberant space. The components of that reverb are, for lack of a better word, disjointed from each other and then spread amongst the various plugin controls. There are, of course, pre-selections based on the type of room we want to use that have been well thought out by the plugin manufacturers to approximate specific types of spaces as a starting point, as you can see here and here. However, these are still the product of different configurations of more or less the same types of reverb components, which have been broken down. Convolution reverbs, on the other hand, offer less customization than algorithmic due to the fact that these are based on real life acoustic spaces. Some more expensive plugins offer customization over some parts of the reverb spaces, but can rely on time stretching algorithms in order to change the size of the space, for example. And for the most part, I think this type of manipulation should be avoided in favor of choosing a different acoustic space. It's my feeling that time stretching to change the room size, as is the case here with Altiverb, is similar to time stretch editing, which more often than not misses the mark sonically. The sound of the real room has a lush and wonderful dimension to it that is inherent in the convolution capture. So, the last thing you'd want to do is alter that by introducing algorithms to change those dimensions. This is just my personal feeling on that. Convolution reverbs offer anything from the great concert halls of Europe to the inside of a person's mouth, an office space, a vacuum cleaner pipe, or a trash can. You can also find modeling of hardware reverbs such as Bricasti, Yamaha Rev 7, and Lexicon units, as well as real plate or spring reverbs, to name a few. But for the purposes of simplicity, I'll refer to these all as an acoustic space, as I endeavour to explain how convolution reverbs work. If the acoustic space exists, then there is likely a means to capture that space or gear so that we can use that in our recordings. Convolution reverbs are captured by recording the room or space with a microphone or microphones placed in a mono, stereo, or multi microphone configuration inside the room, and then fed a source signal via a speaker from within the room or directly from a broadband transient signal such as a starter pistol or balloon popping. As you can see in this diagram, they have placed speakers in stereo in this configuration. Mics can be placed where room mics might typically be placed during a tracking session. If using the capture method of exciting the room via a speaker, as is the case here, either bursts of pink noise or long sine wave sweeps are used to do this. Sine wave sweeps are said to yield the most accurate reverb sounds. In the case of broadband transient loud signals, these can be used to excite the room after the loud bang or pop, with the initial peak information then being removed from the signal, leaving behind the early reflections and sustained tone of the room. We call this an impulse response. This is the essence of that acoustic space that is being modeled. In the case of the sine wave sweep method, I would assume a similar process of removal of the original sine wave sweep from the signal and the leftover information being consolidated to form a spectral fingerprint of that acoustic environment. It is then the job of the convolution reverb to decode the impulse response information in such a way that it can be used to recreate the sound of that room on whichever instrument we'd like to place within it. The idea being that we are essentially placing our instrument where the impulse began in the room, which is here in this case, and simulating its propagation throughout the room, bouncing off walls, with the response of the room being captured by the room mics. So, in essence, what we're doing is placing our instrument here in the room, and these are the room mics for it. This response becomes the reverberation of our instrument relative to the microphone positions and starting point of the impulse. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. So what we end up with is a representation of anything we feed into that convolution reverb based on the set positions and starting point of the impulse and the captured response by the microphones. Convolution reverbs often sound very realistic if they were expertly captured using high quality equipment and can have a lot of perceived depth, but can suffer from a lack of ability to manipulate them after the fact. However, there are plenty of free impulse response libraries available if you search for them, and you're bound to find an impulse response that serves your needs. Whether arrived at algorithmically or by convolution impulse response, there are also various types of reverbs based on digital gear and mechanical gear. You can see here we've got some plates. And that's obviously modeling a spring reverb from a Fender amp. We've also got an AMS, which many accredit to the 80s snare sound. That kind of almost gated sounding. Which is pretty evident in the waterfall plot. It's got quite a large resonance on the bass end and also on the treble end. Everything else is kind of flat in the middle, and it just kind of more or less stops dead. It would be my guess that the extraction process of the mechanically or hardware-derived reverb sounds would most likely involve a similar process as described previously with the room, but with the impulse being sent via a console or DAW, and then the response being recorded back into a digital format for processing and decoding. Let's have a listen to some of these in action. So this is a non-linear reverb, which is similar to the AMX, but it's a much cheaper sounding version of it. I mean, and that I probably wouldn't use anywhere near as much of that. It does need quite a bit of tailoring to get it to sound good. We've got a spring reverb which can work in various different circumstances. Not sure it's working in this one. And deverb. Just use a smaller setting with the plate. Don't mind that one. The Scarlet reverb. Not a huge fan of that one. That, as the air reverb also indicated, would need quite a bit of tailoring to get it to sound good. This one's quite good. As we can change the sound of it quite easily. Probably one of the more useful algorithmic reverbs. Out of all of these, I probably like the deverb and the true verb the most. And we'll flip over to some convolution. So you can see the positions are changing here based on how they captured the impulse response. So we've now got a mono source, even though we've got stereo drums. We've got, looks like an XY miking setup. As you can see, each of these offer very different tones. That's actually using omnidirectional mics, whereas the other one that was far is using cardioid pattern pointed at the walls. That's a very cool one. So as you can see, whoa. That's more like a gated sort of sound. You can really hear how your choice in reverb makes a massive difference as to how it blends or doesn't blend. And the last one is Ozone, which I believe is a hybrid algorithmic and convolution style reverb. You can change the levels of the early reflections versus the low decay, high decay. Don't worry about all of these, we'll go into them in the coming weeks. So, regardless of which type you choose, know the differences and apply them accordingly to meet your specific needs. Until next time, happy mixing. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for new tutorials or require mixing services, please email me at yamahadrums2009@hotmail.com and please subscribe to remain informed of future video releases.